Welcome to another presentation looking at the letter written to the Romans. This is the third presentation in the series, and we're going to begin to look at the latter part of chapter 1. Presentation 4 will complete this section. I've entitled this, Morality Collapsed. Let's look back for a moment or two at what we've come across so far. Paul uses two key ideas right throughout this letter: righteousness and faith or faithfulness. Righteousness, we saw this had two meanings, linked meanings. It can describe our status before God, declared acceptable by Him. But it can also describe our lifestyle, a lifestyle of right living that reflects God's nature. But our status leads to lifestyle, not the reverse. Because we are acceptable, God can empower us to live quality lives. Paul develops this idea of righteousness throughout this letter, but that direction is critical, as we shall see. The other word is faithfulness. It can be translated faith or faithfulness, but I think perhaps at times faithfulness is a better translation. One word means both. Faith, one act; faithfulness, an ongoing. And we can describe it this way. Faith or faithfulness is our response to God. We take God seriously, we listen to what He says, and then we act accordingly. Faith is not a word of intellect, it is not a word of belief, faith is a word of action. It's our response to what God says. And therefore faithfulness is sometimes a better translation. Central themes of this letter, these two words: righteousness and all the words that are connected to it, faith or faithfulness and all the words connected to it. And Paul develops these throughout this letter in some detail. God's righteousness, and God's righteousness is to be seen in His faithfulness towards humanity. God's agenda is the best for you and me all the time. That's why He sent Jesus. And God interacts with us always for our benefit. But we have to respond if we're going to receive the benefit. That's our faithfulness, our response to His faithfulness. And that is an expression of God's righteousness. That's God's agenda. What He looks for is our response. God always takes the initiative, but the initiative doesn't become real for us unless we're willing to respond. That's up to us. But let's move on from that introduction and let's look at what the remainder of chapter 1 speaks. And it's not a good picture that it presents. It's a tough and hard picture. It speaks about the human dilemma. Basically centers around that. We each want our independence. We want to do it our way. We want to run it our way. We want control over our lives. We think we know best what we want to say and do. And that means we don't need a God in our lives. We can do it ourselves. So we push God out or to the edge. And we think that gives us freedom. And we have this illusion of freedom. The freedom means there are no constraints. We can do what we want. We decide. We know what's best. We can run our own lives. That's the human dilemma. But history shows how that ends with disaster. Now, a word of warning. Paul is describing here in this chapter Greek and Roman culture and society of his day. He's not listing a set of things to do or not to do. He's not pointing the finger and accusing people. He's offering a description of the consequences of the human dilemma, of doing things our way, and where it leads in the end. Now, much of it is a picture which fits today, but basically he's speaking about the cultural setting of his day. He's describing the inevitable consequences when we squeeze God out of our lives or to the edge of our lives and we run it our way, ourselves. This is where it leads, is what Paul is saying. And it is not a good picture. But let's look at the actual text. The wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of people who suppress the truth by their wickedness, since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. For although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him. But their thinking became futile, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Though they claimed to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like a mortal human being, and birds, and animals, and reptiles. This pictures what was going on at that time in the Roman culture. Now, many ordinary folk didn't follow this line. Sometimes it was imposed upon them. But this was the cultural drive and direction in the Roman Empire at that time. We don't like to think of God being angry, and we're going to look at the anger of God in a moment or two. But let's just very briefly say that God is angry because God cares. In the same way as a parent is angry because a parent cares for the welfare of their child and doesn't like to see anything messing up their child. It isn't emotional anger, it's anger because God is love, he cares. God has provided much evidence about himself. Simply by looking at the world around, we can deduce all kinds of things about the God who made the world. But we think we know better than God. And basically that's because it allows us to do what we want. We want to run our own lives, take our own decisions, do our own thing. We don't want constraints or restraints. We think freedom means no restraints. We think we know better than God. There are consequences for it. In all of us, there's a built-in desire, a built-in capacity to worship. And if God's pushed out, something or someone else takes its place. Now, in those days, there were little temples all over the Roman Empire with little idols representing humans, birds, animals, and reptiles, and people would worship these. Now, we don't do that so much today, but we have all kinds of modern idolatry, things that we put as priorities in our life, and we worship them. We center our lives on them because we push God out, and we've got to have something to worship. But let's move on. What's the result, therefore? Therefore God gave them over in the sinful desires of their hearts to sexual impurity, for the degrading of their bodies with one another. They exchanged the truth about God for a lie, and worshipped and served created things, rather than the Creator, who is forever praised. Amen. Because of this, God gave them over to shameful lusts. Even their women exchanged natural sexual relations for unnatural ones. In the same way, the men also abandoned natural relations with the women, and were inflamed with lust for one another. Men committed shameful acts with other men and received in themselves the due penalty for their error. It's quite an accurate picture of what life was like, at least in part, in the Roman Empire. So often sex had got coupled in to various temple worship formats, and people came to worship at these temples, worshipping the created things. But they earned brownie points before their God by having sex with prostitutes in the temple. The prostitutes could be boys, the prostitutes could be women. And of course, sexual diseases were passed around pretty rapidly. It's a picture of life then. Consensual homosexual relationships in the Roman Empire days were almost unheard of. But homosexuality in the sense of the abuse of others and the exploitation of others was very common. This is a picture of the time. You see, we're all born to worship something or someone. And if we squeeze God out, something or someone takes its place. And if we squeeze God out, we've squeezed truth out. We're going to have a look at truth in a moment or two. Just what is truth? Exchanging the truth about God for a lie. And then the abuse of sex, where sex was presented often in a religious sense or in a sense of the power that you had over someone else. That's an abuse of a loving relationship between a man and a woman. Very common in those days. Not a good picture, but it goes on furthermore. Just as they did not think it worthwhile to retain the knowledge of God, so God gave them over to a depraved mind, so that they do what ought not to be done. They become filled with every kind of wickedness, evil, greed, and depravity. They're full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, malice. They're gossips, slanderers, God-haters, insolent, arrogant, boastful. They invent ways of doing evil. They disobey their parents. They have no understanding, no fidelity, no love, no mercy. Although they know God's righteous decree that those who do such things deserve death, they not only continue to do these very things, but also approve of those who practice them. And again, that's a very accurate picture of so much that was going on in the culture of that day. Not a good picture. God has given to us humans freedom. We take our own decisions, yes. And when we decide to push God out, push him to the side, God often leaves us. You want it that way, he says? Okay, go that way. But there are consequences. Actions always have consequences. And the consequence here is of a society falling apart. Each person wanting their way. Well, we can't all have our way, because we will conflict with each other. So that list, that horrendous list, is the outcome. Basically, society falls apart. And in our selfish desires to run our own lives and do our own thing and aim for our own pleasure and our desires, the whole business of relationships and integrity vanish. And it even goes that far. Wrongdoing becomes politically correct. Not a good picture. But Paul is simply reflecting back the picture of much in the Roman Empire of his day, where there was so much evil, where so many people got hurt, where the weak, the dispossessed, the unwealthy in society were abused by those who had power and influence. Not a good picture. Now the passage raises all kinds of big questions, and in this presentation, the following, we're going to look at some of these big questions. Can we ever be certain about anything? How can God be angry? And why is God so opposed to idolatry, where we worship something or someone other than himself? Why the focus on the sexual issues in the early part? Does God just give up on us? He gave them over, it says 3 times. And what do we mean by freedom? Can we ever really be free? Or is it all an illusion? And highly relevant in our world today, why does evil sometimes seem to erupt up and take everything over? Let's look at some of these issues as Paul presents them in this passage. Starting with truth. I want to suggest that truth comes by looking at the evidence. It's worthwhile stopping and think of things that you believe in or that you believe are true, and just simply stop and ask yourself, what's the evidence? In the world where I've been employed for so long, research. That is the fundamental principle that we always use. What's the evidence? And we usually get it experimentally, but it can come from many sources. Paul says that the evidence points to a creator. Someone who's all-powerful, has an amazing ability. We'll look at that in a moment. and he's made something of that known to all humanity. But we choose to ignore it most of the time. That was what's happening in the Roman Empire of the day. Truth was being suppressed. Evidence was being ignored, twisted, altered. And it still is today. See, that leads to a truth distortion. And if we look around today, we see that all over the place. Coming out through our media, in societies, in communities, in the workplace. You see, if you suppress the truth, not honest, you end up with things going wrong. When things go wrong, it leads to a requirement to suppress the truth even further. It's a kind of circle, each feeds off the other. And you end up worshipping things, or perhaps people. But we've lost the centrality of God, the Creator, the Lord, the All-Powerful. Sometimes we worship human beings, or our brains, or our minds, or our abilities. That's the picture that Paul is presenting here. Let's go a little bit further with it. There are outcomes from this. Paul paints them. And he uses that sad phrase, God gave them over. If we persist in choosing to do it our way, running our own lives, pursuing our own agenda, God says, okay, if you want it that way, I've made you to have freedom, go that way. But there are consequences. Let me just picture 5 of them. We think we can do it ourselves. But the trouble is, if we think that, we tend to build everything around what makes us feel good. And it leads to relationships falling apart, because what makes us feel good sometimes takes from others. And particularly in the closest relationship between any two human beings, where that arrogant, self-centered attitude comes in, distortions will come. Paul speaks of a loss of love or mercy. Our agenda is us. Love means our agenda is the benefit of the other. We even end up justifying what is blatantly wrong, and indeed supporting others and encouraging others to follow that line. These are the consequences that Paul paints for his culture, and it's still true today. Because we've pushed God to the side, we've ignored the truth, we've ignored the evidence. And that means we're worshipping our minds. We think we know better. It means that we're worshipping sexual relationships, satisfaction, and it distorts it. It's exploitative. And it means worshipping things. In modern language, we can see it this way. That's the basis of humanism. We think we know better. The world centres around humanity, our minds, our abilities. We're not that clever. Not compared to God anyway. And we're pursuing that which gives us selfish pleasure. That sex gives pleasure. It's designed for that. But it was designed for so much more. And we live in a society in the West which is governed by materialism, the pursuit of possessions. Where is our God? We're not talking about idols and little temples. We're talking about our mind. We're talking about the pursuit of our happiness, gratification. We're talking about the things that we can gather, accumulate, and possess when we exchange the truth about God for lies. But still, what is truth? Let's just look at this a little bit more. I'm going to suggest 7 possible directions. I based this on Paul, but I've modernized it into the modern cultures of today. We can simply decide, I think it's true because I think it's true. That's arrogance. I think it's true because I want it to happen. That's wishful thinking. I think it's true because it makes me feel good, it brings me benefit. That's selfishness. I think it's true because it works. That's pragmatism. In Islam, what is true is what benefits Islam. That's clearly taught, both in the Quran and in their scholarly documents. That's an assumption. I think it's true because the majority agree with me. History shows us that is true. For Pilate, when he cynically said, "What is truth?" for him, truth was political expedience. That's dishonest. And sometimes we say, "I only believe it if it can be proved." As science never proves anything. It's a misunderstanding of the way science works. Nothing is provable in that sense, although I make a slight exception in some areas of mathematics. That's just an excuse. These are the kind of things that float around in our cultures today. And in various forms, they floated around in the culture of Paul's day. Truth, or that which is true. I suggest it's that which is in accordance with fact or reality. And back to the word evidence. That which fits the facts or the reality, the evidence. Now that assumes that there's something out there beyond us which is objectively correct. People criticise that assumption, but if we stop and think for a moment, if you don't make that assumption, then the whole of the world of science collapses, because science is based on a simple act of faith that the world out there is objectively correct. It functions according to some principles, and they're constant. So it's a very reasonable assumption. But let's go one step further. That is some claim. How do we know that Jesus was right when he said, "I am the truth"? It's embodied in me. Everything I am, said, everything that I have done embodies the truth. Well, God showed that Jesus was right when he made that claim, because God raised Jesus from death on the third day after his crucifixion. And he was seen by hundreds. He said, "I am the truth. The truth is embodied in me." Bring it together a little bit. Truth is that which fits the evidence, or even that which best fits the evidence, because sometimes it's developing. And that should guide our actions. And that's why truth is so important. Paul has grasped this. If we don't get the truth, then the way we behave will be affected. And it can cause chaos in our lives and in the lives of other people. That's the crunch point. Truth is based on evidence. An awful lot of religion falls apart at the seams in that. All religions. Because they've ignored the evidence. Truth is based on the evidence. And Paul's argument is something like this. Look at the universe and the logical way it seems to work. Look at our minds and the logical way our minds appear to work. All that points to a creator. It does not prove there is a creator. It points to a creator. But if we reject that notion, we're going to end up worshipping something else. Maybe our minds. Maybe things. Maybe people. Maybe even religion. And sooner or later, that's what happens. Relationships fall apart, and the closest relationship we can ever have with another human is the one that's open to the greatest abuse. And societies fall apart. That was what was happening in the Roman Empire then, and if we look at history, the Roman Empire slowly got more and more corrupted all over the place, till eventually it was so corrupt it couldn't stand the onslaught from outside and it collapsed. History shows that's always true. Paul is following a cold logic here. He's acutely aware that there's a spiritual world that we human beings are sensitive to. It is simply a fact of evidence that all cultures everywhere in the history of the world have their spiritual dimension. They generate their gods, if you like. It seems to be something we human beings have to have. Paul is aware there's a logic in the way the world runs, even within the limitations of his understanding. We can see today that the universe operates under logical laws. And there's a logic to the human mind, albeit we sometimes make a mess of it. But the human mind, through the sciences in recent centuries, has started to appreciate the structure of the logic of the universe. And in every society, in every culture, in every person, there is something of a sense of right and wrong. So cultures develop moral codes. You can go back millennia and you'll find them written down in some of the early Middle Eastern cultures. That's always there. And what Paul is saying is this: the presence of all of that suggests a lawmaker. All that points to there being a creator God who has moral, ethical standards. An almighty creator God. You see, the very existence of the world around us points to a creator. Doesn't prove it, points to a creator. But a creator who has extraordinary abilities, power and capacity. Because the more we look at the universe, the more complex and wonderful it appears to be. And our minds are pitted against things that we can scarcely understand. That's not a problem to God. But the more we look at ourselves, every culture has a kind of God consciousness, however we call it. And in every culture there's something of a sense of right and wrong. That points to a creator who possesses an ethical nature. Doesn't prove it, it points to it. That's what Paul is saying. Look at the physical world and look at human beings. Together they point to a creator. And they tell us something about what the creator is likely to be like. That's the starting point. We can push it aside, we can ignore it, we can pretend the evidence is not there, but the evidence is there. And Paul is seeing it. Now you could argue it all arose by chance. But if you argue that, which people are arguing today, there are consequences for that viewpoint. Let me just pick up one or two. If it's all chance, then we human beings, our task is to be driven by the imperatives of chance. That means that survival is the most important thing, and leaving lots of children is the most important thing. Survival and procreation. Now that alone will generate things in society which we would not like. It means that there's no basis of ethics that's subjective. They're just expressions of self-interest for our benefit. And there's no place for love. Love means our agenda is the benefit of the other. That if we're in this by chance, then the key thing is for us to live as long as we can and for us to leave behind as many descendants. So any concept of altruism, doing things for others just because they need help, that's out the window. Now here's some of the consequences of saying it's all chance. You see, the evidence doesn't fit. But actually, if you look at people who take this line, they started off by assuming that God doesn't exist. And then they're trying to justify it. And they do that because if they acknowledged God's existence, our lifestyle choices that they have made would be disturbed. So there's even an illogicality in that viewpoint. Paul is aware of all of this. I've dressed it up in modern language. He's aware of God's eternal power and divine nature. He accepts that God has revealed something of himself to all humanity. And the evidence comes from the fact that there is a universe out there and the way it works. The evidence comes from history, from events of history that show the patterns of God's behaviour. The evidence comes from within ourselves and the capacities we've got which reflect something of the Creator. And the evidence comes perhaps most of all in the life of Jesus, well documented by many sources and beyond reasonable doubt. They don't prove God exists, and they don't prove exactly, but they point to. And it's there for all humanity. Now we've got two choices. This is what Paul sees so vividly. Two choices. We can suppress that truth. We can suppress the evidence. We can ignore the evidence. We can push God out of our lives, or we can accept the evidence and accept there's a God. And if there's a God, there are implications for our lives. Centuries ago, the great philosopher wrote that. How true it is today. Simply from a philosophical standpoint, two things awe me most, he said. The starry sky above me, that's the world of creation, blows his mind. But also the moral law within me, that within every human being was a sense of right or wrong. These are things that point towards God, the mighty creator of the universe, and the God who has ethical and moral standards. What a beautiful picture. Now we're going to leave it at this point, and we're going to pick up these things further in the next part, where we're going to look at some of the other issues that arise from this chapter that Paul has presented to us. Morality collapsed.